Just before I start, the talks today have been really great, and I just wanted to express my gratitude for letting me, a little Parley Waller, join in with the classics. I'm just gonna quickly share my screen. I'm gonna work that out, and because I am not super great with tech. Can you all see that? Is that all okay? Are we here? I'm going to keep it just like this because I'm also going to be reading from my notes to chat about everything and make sure that I get through it. So yeah, my paper is called Right Distance Towards an Ethic of Care in Queer Translation of Pali Texts, or Working Out How to Care for Texts That Give Me Hope. So I'd like to start by sharing a quote from a very important sutta to me. Itibhavo kinkariya chitam hi susamahite jnanami vattamanam hi samadhamang vipassato yasanu nasiya evang itaaham purisottova kinchiva pana anyasmi tang maro vatumara hatiti. How might womanhood perform when my mind is settled well, when insight is present, when the Dharma is seen properly? For whoever thinks I am a woman or I am a man, or even I am someone else, they are fit to speak with Mara. I first read this sutta back in 2017, and at the time I was very ill. My grip of reality was slippery wet, lubricated with the palmy sweat of existential dread. My mind was unsettled. So I'd asked my tutor, Dr. Andrew Skilton, the only doctor of use at the time, if we could study texts about madness and gender in our weekly Pali lessons. In hindsight, this was no less than a cry for help from a 20-year-old whose identity was rapidly dissolving into a solution of nearly their thoughts and stapled breasts on chests. That week, Andrew introduced me to Soma. She was a nun who'd ventured alone into the Undervana, the dark woods, to meditate. These woods were a dangerous place, a site of violence, theft, and rape, and the Buddha had decreed that not even monks should go there alone. And yet this was precisely where Soma found herself, alone at the foot of a tree in the Undervana. As she began to meditate, Mara, the Buddhist equivalent of the devil, appeared to her, taunting her with the assumed spiritual inferiority of women. Her response is traditionally understood as a robustly feminist retort, calmly rejecting the words of Mara, or perhaps her inner demons. She asserts that womanhood, and gender as a whole, has nothing to do with the spiritual inaptitude. Despite the power many have gleaned from her words, this was not, however, the insight that stayed with me. The gift she gave with me, in many ways, was much more personally profound. Anyasmi, I am something else. This word was at once an offering and a reassurance. 2,000 years ago, Soma gave me permission. Caveated with the reminder that gender identity held too close can be harmful, she confirmed that there was an existence outside of I am woman or I am man. There is something beyond the binary. No doubt because of an Oxford-bred yearning for canonical affirmation, suddenly a part of my confused and slippery identity, or rather the confusion and slipperiness of my identity, was validated. Now, I do not intend to paint Soma as some redeemer figure who miraculously healed my ailments with the breath of her words. However, Soma was attentive to a particular moment of struggle. Soma had shown me care. She too was a woman beyond gender, sat alone in a dark place, tormented by her own thoughts. For the first time, I felt like I had company. After reading the Soma Sutta, I began to identify the generative relationship between Pali literature and my own understandings of queerness. Whilst researching, I met a wealth of generously insightful texts from Saraya and their enlightenment through numerous sex changes to the tender homoeroticism of Manikanta, the Serpent King. Repeatedly touched by their relevance to my own life, I decided to undertake the task of performing a series of queer translations of these texts. My intentions for the project were more than personal, however. Following Kaji Armen's suggestion that we might rework queer theory by rerouting it in its own forgotten genealogies, as well as in alternative theoretical traditions, to borrow the quote from the conference, I wanted to explore the insights Pali literature could offer to queer theory. A critical or literary analysis of the text, however, did not feel appropriate to the generosity these texts have been giving me. Instead, I decided the process of an experimental queer translation without really understanding what that would entail. I cared too much for these texts to put them through the harsh thrashing of an academic critical analysis, and rather wanted to offer the texts, wants to offer the text to other readers who might see something else, but equally as touching in the text that I had. So in the lineage of the auto-theoretical work of Maggie Nelson and Paul B. Preciado, I conceived of a queer translation as a mode of auto-translation, if such a thing can even exist. If queer approaches to theory valued personal experience as a means of generating knowledge and destabilizing norms, then how could this practice be applied to translation? In this way, my subjectivity sat at the core of the translation process, simultaneously showcasing the texts and demonstrating the exciting ways they could be read through one's own experience. But with subjectivity comes positionality, and complex difficulties began to arise. What did it mean for me, a white Briton, to use classical Indian literature for the service of Western queer theory? To keep in line with Kaji Armen, if queer theory has always been a promiscuous borrowing of, if queer theory has always been a promiscuous borrowing of disparate theoretical traditions, then how does my borrowing from Pali texts for the development of Western critical inquiry differ from, say, the British Museum borrowing global artifacts from colonized nations? Now, though the material stakes vastly differ, in both activities resides the uncomfortable process of tearing an article of culture from its home context, all for the benefit of the colonizing holder of power. Moreover, if valuing subjectivity requires the translator to incorporate their own experiences into the translation, in this case, that would mean centering the white British voice in the classical Indian text. I was becoming increasingly aware of the colonial entanglement such a practice entailed. A post-colonial perspective values the retention of the awkwardness of translation. Rather than smoothing over odd-sounding edges with an Anglophone lyricism of strawberries, cream, and cricket wipes, the voice of the original language should be maintained, however peculiar to the English ear. To smooth is to erase, and English readability is prioritized over the integrity of the translated text. If my notion of a queer translation went even beyond this nativization by actively positioning my white British voice and experiences inside the translation, then it could be nothing less than an act of colonialism. The act of ethically rerouting queer theory to forgotten genealogies and alternative theoretical traditions would then ultimately be undermined. Suddenly, queer theory's promiscuous borrowing insidiously is transformed into promiscuous exploitation. To make matters worse, if queer approaches are set in the critical destabilization of norms, then any act of colonialism, which inherently reinforces historical oppressive normativity, would not be queer. This meant the queer was taken out of the queer translation and the project was on the verge of collapse. So I needed to address this tension between queer and post-colonial attitudes towards translation. In other words, I needed to accommodate both my subjectivity and my positionality. Now, I have yet to come up with a neat answer, nor do I think I ever will. It is precisely at these impassable junctions when I might light up an incense and sit with a sutta and meditate and hope that a solution may arise. Now, in trying to consider an appropriate step forward, it was vital for me to take a path that is tailored to the problem, choosing a solution that does what it says and says what it does. So the solution must be in the texts themselves. So I turned back to Somar. What does she say and what does she do? Well, she showed me care. Now, however wishy-washy this sounds, I feel like these text can care for me, and I feel that we can do the same thing. Now, I'm aware that this can sound a bit a bit new age hippie. As a close friend of mine told me, you're one step away from calling these texts both your mum and your dad. I lived with you for 2 years, and trust me, it wasn't those sutters that were saving you from your mental health. So what do I mean when I say Soma shows me care? Well, Maria Puig de la Bellacasa understands care through more than human worlds. She makes the commitment to decentering the human from discussions of care, calling for us to consider both how we may care for more than human entities and how more than human entities may care for each other and us. Care is not restricted to human action. This phrase, more than human, feels particularly useful when discussing texts, which lie in the murky realm between human object and non-human object. Whilst a text is scarcely a living, breathing, sweating, pissing, bona fide human being, it is a snapshot, a remnant, a culmination of human thought. Just because these thoughts are freed from a fleshy embodiment, however, does not mean they are stripped away from activity. Text and objects at large still do things without being discretely human. Much as a toaster may burn your bread or the world may suffer, I believe these texts may care. What then is this caring that I'm claiming these texts to do? De la Bellacasa, moving from Joe in Toronto, poses care as a triptych tension between affect or affectations, labor or work, and ethics or politics. These three dimensions of care may be distributed unevenly, at times contradicting one another, but they are each vital in understanding care critically. The first dimension, affect and affectation, considers the affective aspects of care, such as love and affection, though de la Bellacasa notes there are instances where affective engagement is not prerequisite to the action of care, for example, when employed as a care worker. The second dimension entails the active aspect of care. Labor moves the moral disposition of caring about into the maintaining, sustaining action of caring for, to follow Joan Toronto in 1993. The final dimension notes the implicit positioning involved in care, caring for one thing and not another, the outrage at its absence. To then apply this to the Soma Sutta, I have felt a sense of love and affection given to me through its attentiveness to my specific needs at a specific time, delivered in a specific way. 2, the sutta has stayed with me, appearing to the foreground of my thoughts when it is most needed. And 3, it has demonstrated an ethical, political position through its moral detailing of gender. So if these texts can care for me, then how can I care for them? De la Bellacasa notes that care puts an emphasis on interconnection and interdependency. Interconnectedness is at the core of this project, fundamentally the question being the interconnection between queer theory and Pali literature. But what de la Bellacasa moves towards here is a sense of reciprocity. An emphasis on independency requires us not just to think about what the Pali Canon can give to queer theory or how I can care or how it can care for me, but also what queer theory can give to the Pali Canon or how I can care for it. Any effective care work must start with the identification of needs. So what does the Pali Canon need? On religious grounds, the literature is informed by an imperative of conversion. Early Buddhism was a proselytizing religion which encouraged the wide dissemination of its materials. Spread orally, these texts were spoken and written in order to be shared. Today, the institutional study of Pali in the UK, perhaps unsurprisingly, has been waning since its colonial heyday in the 20th century. Its final dedicated post in SOAS was discontinued in 2017, and fewer departments offering its study even at postgraduate level. A somewhat of an endangered discipline, the reading of Pali and its literature is stagnating. This poses crisis for a literature whose purpose is to be read and heard. In this way, the texts need to be spread to communities that have not yet heard it. Practically speaking, a queer translation of the canon can do just that, by highlighting relevances to queer people through queer means. Now, this is not to say this project is a missionary activity. I believe the value of queer literature lies beyond its religious importance, but its intention is in part to introduce these texts to more readers who hopefully can gain their own personal value from the insights these texts are seeking to give. However, just because queer theory can cater to the needs of a text does not suggest it is absolved of colonial imposition of the translator's voice. Identifying what queer theory can do doesn't inherently dictate how best to enact this doing through care. This how can be answered by applying the affect, labor, ethic triptych to the process of translation. 1, affect. To harness love, admiration, or enthusiasm for the text as a motivating factor. This should inform a respect for the literature and its contexts. 2, labor. To give appropriate time, energy, and thought to both contextual research and the translation itself. This involves the maintenance of the text's vitality. 3, ethics. To maintain a political engagement with the kind of or amount of care the text is given. This includes reflecting on the efficacy of the care work. Whilst these dimensions provide a framework to do care under, it is unclear precisely how these practices manifest. However, at the core of working with care lies not a list of predestined practices, but rather a reflective provocation. What happens to our work when we pay attention to moments where the question of how to care is insistent, but not easily answerable? Care practices are not preset. They are revealed by working through or with care. Attentive and effective actions can only be truly caring if they are reactive to the problems that arise over time. In this way, these actions of care can only be worked out by performing one's practice with or through care as an engaged, speculative provocation. So what relevance does this have to the tension between subjectivity and positionality in the dilemma facing queer translation of Pali texts? The query is ultimately one of proximity. My subjectivity is too close for a post-colonial translation, and my positionality is too far for a queer translation. Here I'd like to return to Dulabella Casa, where she states, care is not about fusion, but it can be about right distance. The tension between subjectivity and positionality is then a riddle of proximity. If a subjectively informed translation places the translator inside the text, and if a positionally informed translation places the translator away from the text, then a care-informed translation places the translator at the side of the text. To place oneself too closely to a text or to delve within it ruptures the boundaries between the text's content and interpretation. This is not care, this is violence. To distance oneself too far from the text or to attempt a notion of objectivity ignores the subjectivity inherent in the translator. This is not caring, this is neglect. Instead, a translator might place their experiences in close proximity to the translation. By doing so, dialogue can be established between the source text and the interpretation and experiences of the translator. In this way, one lovingly maintains appropriate space for the actualization of ethically generated knowledge production. This process might better be called a conversation or a collaboration, more than or as well as a translation. Through this notion of reciprocal care, with Pali text working to care for me and with me working to care for Pali text, comes a sense of working together. My experiences and the text, though kept distinct, are interdependent and interconnected. In the space between and beyond this right binary distance exists a generative space for queer knowledge production, with contemporary queer experiences recontextualizing the Pali Canon and the Pali Canon rerouting our queer genealogy. Now, this still isn't a neat solution. Even in the subtlest of ways, my voice and experiences will seep into the process of translation. And so my subjectivity and my positionality won't be able to resist their forbidden unity on the page. However, the provocation of care with its dimensions of affect, labor, and ethics, and its insistence on right distance might provide us with the suitable tools to start searching for a more stable answer. If then work is required for the movement from caring about to caring for, then the activity of ethical queer translation of Pali texts can only be achieved through practice. Now, I'm just going to stop sharing and I'm coming towards the end here. One thing that I would just like to open up for the questions of how to put in this practice or how to actualize this practice is considering what things can we practically do to create these situations for care. So one might be the incorporation of the communities that use these texts into the process of translation. So that might be about setting up dialogue with them directly or showing them the translation and having them an editorial voice. It might be about letting the source text exist on the page alongside the translation. So they're not together, but they are distinct on the page, separated, but in conversation with one another. And another might be about the transparency of positionality and accountability to failure in our desires to enact care. And these can only be understood or achieved through practice. So that's that. Thank you all for listening to me babble on. Let me know if you've got any questions. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is I'd like to think that this ethic of care applies, I think, to anything, any text that we're translating that isn't within our cultural lineage. That's what I'd like to hopefully put out there. So yeah, great. Babble, babble on, Chromatica, bury that.